Okay, so good afternoon to everyone. So thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to present my work in this very interesting symposium. So in this presentation, I would like to give you an overview of our work in the attempt to advance the understanding of the chemomechanical degradation of oil painting by using a mechanistic perspective, which basically combines a modeling and an experimental work. So before starting, I should also acknowledge the co-authors of the work, and especially I would like to acknowledge Gijs Ommelon and Ali Bagheri Behboud, who are PhD students that worked substantially on this project. So in the talk, I will talk about two main topics. One relates to the modeling, and particularly I will talk about the formation of metal soaps in oil paintings. And the second part, how do I change the slide? In the second part, I will... with this?
Yes.
No, okay, sorry. No, okay, sorry, technical problem. In the second part, I will talk about experiments, and particularly an experimental methodology that is based on in situ microtensile testing of oil paint. So let me start with the modeling part that relates to the formation of metal soaps. I guess I'm talking with an audience that is familiar with the phenomenon of metal soaps, but I would like to take this amazing example. This is a painting of Vermeer, View of Delft, which is displayed in the Mauritshuis in Den Haag. And if you look at the surface in detail, you can see that it is characterized by a huge number of these white protrusions, which are actually metal soap particles that form due to the reaction between the oil binder and the pigment particles. So clearly you can see they disfigure the surface of the paint. You can imagine that they are visible with the naked eye, but at the same time, it is clear that they are also associated to some damage phenomena. So we want to understand actually the interaction between this chemical process, metal soap formation, with the mechanics. So let me review a bit the chemistry, the process that is behind this metal soap formation phenomenon. Well, it is well known that paintings are layers of an oil binder medium that contains pigment particles. And the pigment particles that are relevant for this process are either lead or zinc pigments. So upon drying, the oil binder polymerizes into a densely cross-linked polymer network, and actually it releases saturated fatty acids as a degradation product. Also, at the same time, the metal ions can be released by the pigment particles, and they become complexed with the polymer network, forming a so-called ionomer, which is a relatively stable state of the paint. What happens next is that these saturated fatty acids, together with the metal ions, can diffuse in the paint layer, and they can react with each other to form metal soaps first in an amorphous state by means of a reversible reaction. What happens next is that upon the reach of a critical size for these amorphous metal soaps, they can actually crystallize by means of an irreversible reaction. And this crystalline metal soaps formation actually occurs with a volumetric strain, so an expansion of the material that you can imagine introduces strains and stresses in the system that can be responsible for mechanical damage mechanisms. So the point is that this phenomenon is not new. Conservators have observed this, I would say, at least for the last 30 years. So these are some nice images of cross-sections. You can see that there are different possible configurations. For instance, we may have either more diffuse type of aggregates that may be either of lead or zinc, but also when we have zinc lead particles, we have very large aggregates. You can see the scale that is here, 5 micrometers, and this one, 100 micrometers. So these are pretty large particles. So these have been observed, and the chemistry has been subjected to quite substantial studies in the last years. What is still not so well understood is how this mechanical phenomenon interacts with this chemical phenomenon interacts with the mechanics of the system. So we talk about complex systems, right? So this is actually a complex system in which you have a multi-physics problem, mechanics and chemistry that interact with each other. So the goal of this research is actually to develop a multi-physics model, a chemomechanical model that couples a chemical problem by means of diffusion reaction problem that describes the formation of metal soap, and then with a mechanical problem that enables to describe the process of damage, so the mechanical response of the system due to this metal soap formation mechanism. So let me first focus on the details of the diffusion reaction problem. I have a disclaimer. I try to limit as much as possible the number of equations, not to intimidate the audience. I just put some of them, but I will try to explain in a simple terms. Okay, so let me mention a few assumptions that relate to the diffusion reaction model. First of all, as a general assumption, we know that the paint is a heterogeneous material. So we have the paint with embedded pigments, but in our model, we consider the material to be homogeneous. So we basically do not explicitly describe the geometry of the pigments, but just we assume a homogeneous material with effective properties. First of all, we have heard in these days a lot of time talking about ion migrations. Of course, the ion migrate, but this is hypothesized that the diffusion of the ions, of the metal ions, is slower compared to the diffusion of the fatty acids, so that we actually neglect this diffusion. We assume a uniform concentration of the fatty acids, of the metal ions, and we assume that the fatty acids are the only diffusing species in the system. Next, since I have to mention that this process, so the transition between amorphous and crystalline metal soap, requires a nucleation process that is still not well understood, even from the chemical perspective. We assume that there is an initial metal soap crystal of very small size, so a very small particle, for which we assume that the crystallization can occur only at the boundary of these crystals. And finally, we assume that the reaction constants of the chemical reaction are independent of moisture and temperature, despite in reality that might not be the case. So of course, the temperature and the humidity may influence this chemical reaction. So what comes out actually is, this is the chemical process that is described. And what we have to solve is a system of diffusion reaction equations. Just to scare you a little bit, I'll show you the equations, but please look at this side. So keep in mind that this is a complex problem. We have four diffusing or reacting species that are the fatty acids, the metal ions, the amorphous metal soap, and the crystalline metal soaps. The only species for which we consider the diffusion, as I mentioned, are the fatty acids. So what you see here is a system of diffusion reaction equation, but the only diffusion reaction equation is the last one that relates to the fatty acids. The other one are all species that react but do not diffuse. And one other important aspect is that we take the diffusion coefficient to depend on the local concentration of metal soaps, because the fatty acid diffusion will be influenced by the local content of crystalline metal soap. So look at this parameter phi. This is a very important parameter, because if I go back to this scheme that actually relates to the two problems that we are solving, what we do, sorry, I don't know how to make this thing work properly. So what we actually transmit from the diffusion reaction problem to the mechanical problem is this local concentration of crystalline metal soap. This is an input from the chemical model to the mechanical model. So let me give some details on the mechanical problem. Also, connecting to the several discussions that paint is probably viscoelastic, but for the time being, we assume that the bulk material properties of the paint material are elastic. Further on, as I mentioned before, what happens during this chemical process is a transformation of the material from the binder, the ionomer, towards a crystalline metal soap. So from a technical point of view, we need to define a way to describe this change in phase. So for this, we use the phase transformation model without giving to details, which relies on quite simple assumptions. So we assume that the strains of the two phases are the same and the stress is just the average. One other important point is that we have expansion of the crystal. So when the crystal expands, it comes with a strain, an Eigen strain is called in mechanics, and we take this strain to be dependent on the local concentration of crystalline metal soap. Finally, as I mentioned before, sorry, I don't know why it changes the slide alone, but as I mentioned before, we may have that the expansion causes microcracks to be present in the system. So we need to describe this cracking phenomenon. And what we do, we actually use the so-called discrete crack approach with the cohesive zone model. So we have talked about finite elements. You know that finite elements mean that we discretize the domain with smaller subset. Here in the discrete crack approach with cohesive elements, you see that at the interface between all the continuous elements, we place these interface elements. And these interface elements, basically, they can open up. What you see here in the right part of the slide is a traction separation law, is a relation that tells how much the tractions at the faces of these cracks relate to the opening, and this relation is specified as a function of mechanical damage. So let me go back to this scheme. So I mentioned that the chemical problem influences the mechanical problem, right? Because this crystalline metal soap concentration actually is the driving force for creating damage. But if you think about that, also the mechanical problem influences the chemical one. Because when we have cracks that open up, the diffusion of the fatty acids across these crack faces will be changed. So what we send back to the mechanical analysis is the damage parameter that we use to specify relations in terms of flux concentration of the fatty acids at the interface that depend on the mechanical damage parameter. So you see that we have a couple model, is a two-way couple model, and from a technical point of view, we solve first the diffusion reaction problem in a fully coupled way, and then the two models are sequentially coupled. Okay, let me show you a couple of simulations, but before doing that, I want to discuss about the material parameters that we use for the model. So as for the diffusion reaction model, we actually calibrated the model on some experiments that were done by Jun Hermans for his PhD thesis in 2017. So what he basically did, he prepared an ionomer sample based on lead, and he put it on the back of a measurement cell that was filled by a fatty acid solution. So the fatty acids diffuse in this direction. You see that it's a one-dimensional diffusion problem for the fatty acids, and then they penetrate the ionomer, and here they will react to form metal soaps. So the metal soap concentration was measured at the bottom of this measurement cell. So what we did, actually, we translated our model into a one-dimensional model in which we have a region in which we have only diffusion of fatty acids, basically in this part where there is the fatty acid solution, and then a diffusion reaction model that is actually the full model that I described just in this part. And we could fit the numerical model through the experiments to find out the parameters that we are using in the model. So as for the mechanical properties, those are based on literature work. Again, that's a paper from Laura and co-workers that again relates to lead properties, and we calibrated both continuum properties and interface properties in this regard. So, okay, so let me show a simulation. Before looking really at the movie, look at this. This is what we are simulating. This is a two-dimensional representation of a cross-section of a paint layer in which we have initial nuclei that are prescribed. As I mentioned, this was an assumption of our model. And what we see here, the plotting variable is the local concentration of crystalline metal soap. So what is fully blue is the original paint material. The fully red material is the fully crystallized material. And you can see that at the reactions, at the transition zone between the two phases, there are some color gradients that actually says that the material is there still partially crystallized, but not fully. So a couple of things that I want you to note, I want to emphasize, is that you see that there are some cracks that develop in the material due to the expansion of these crystals. Some of these cracks also close up later on because the expansion of the crystal also is associated with compressive stresses at a certain point. So initially tensile, but then when it reaches up the surface, these cracks are closed up. One other interesting thing is that you see that these crystals approach the surface, so they actually could mimic somehow some cross-sectional data that we have taken from qualitative analysis that are taken from original samples. So of course, this is a qualitative comparison. I want also to show you another analysis of which I don't have the movie, but this is also interesting. So here we have a metal soap crystal. This is in the initial configuration, and we have two different paint layers for which we have interface elements. So this black line corresponds to the transition between the two materials, and you see that as much as the crystal expands, we have that a crack develops in the top layer, a mode 1 crack, let's say, but also delamination cracks develop at the interface between the two materials. And this is also interesting because it has been reported by observations that often metal soap are associated with delamination between paint layers. So of course I should mention this is very qualitative comparison. We are working on somehow improving the quantitative prediction of this type of model by the work of Emir Dizmana, who is a PhD student, and we are trying to, on a way, improve the constitutive description of the paint, going towards a more viscoelastic, more accurate description of the behavior, but also incorporating more relevant chemical mechanisms. So for instance, hydrolysis, which is an important mechanism of degradation, which is also a source for the fatty acids that actually govern the process of metal soap formation. Okay, so let me now discuss a bit the experiments. And here, I think it's very well connected with the discussion that was held this morning with the nano-indentation. So in my view, there are actually two different scales that are currently considered. So we have, since the work of Mario and Mecklenburg, these pioneering experiments of paint films at the macroscopic scale that are mostly based on tensile testing. On the other hand, we have very small scale experiments that relate to nano-indentation, which they get here very, very important, and because there is the attempt to characterize historical material, real material, if I may use the term. My goal would be actually to try to connect these two different approaches by means of microscale tensile experiments. I say tensile experiments because I think that in a way tensile experiments are easier to interpret than nano-indentation, and to some extent they provide additional information. But I say microscale because despite it's very relevant to study mockups, it's also important to ideally, in a very long term, to be able to do also these tensile experiments on original samples at a very small scale. So this is actually the goal of the methodology that we are developing, to miniaturize tensile stage samples, tensile experiments, to go in the future possibly to analyze original samples. I have to mention that we have developed a methodology. I don't really have many results to show, but I hope to get that feedback, at least on the methodology that we have developed. So the idea is to do in situ microtensile experiments. In situ means that we take images during the test. And actually, this is inspired by some work that we already did in my group. We did characterization of the local mechanical behavior of cellulose fibers, and we applied this to two different case studies. One relates to paper fiber, but also we analyzed the tensile response of fibers and thread from the lining canvas of the night watch. So you see, this is a very cool movie, in my opinion. This is a fiber from the canvas of the night watch, which is subjected to a microtensile experiment. You can also see the scale. This is 100 micrometers. So we thought that this methodology could be somehow adapted to test a small-scale paint sample. So then, well, we prepared the sample. This was a rather standard preparation. I actually should acknowledge Susanne because she helped Ali, PhD student, to prepare the samples. This was done at the Rijksmuseum. So we used cold pressed linseed oil. And I should mention, we have two reference pigment types, titanium white, that was chosen just as a benchmark material with no particular reasons. Plus, we will also have the Prussian blue samples that Susanne prepared for her project, and we will also use this as a benchmark for testing. So we subjected these samples to artificial aging by controlling the temperature and relative humidity to slightly different values for the two classes of samples. Okay, so next, how do we prepare the sample? We have these paint films, and we cut them in very small size. You can see the length scale here. So this distance is about 1 millimeter, and the width of the sample is about 0.5 millimeters. So it's still very far from being micro scale, but we are getting closer. And the sample is constrained to a laser cut PMMA frame that has 2 bridges, and I will show you later that these bridges will be cut before the tensile testing. Also, fashion detail, we use as a glue the nail polish. It proved to be a very convenient glue to fix the sample to the frame. Okay, so this is actually the cross-sectional view that you can see. And as I mentioned, we use in situ methodology. So we take images and we process them to get accurate deformation. So we need a sufficient contrast between the images to compare them in different loading steps. So we need to apply a speckle pattern for DIC. This also reminds a sample that Jacek has shown this morning, right? You see that there is basically a solution. In this case, we use polystyrene particles that were sprayed on the surface of the paint to generate enough contrast when we compare the images later on. I have also to mention that we didn't realize before, that the type of speckle pattern that we apply is very much dependent on the type of pigment. For instance, this relates to Prussian blue samples, while for the titanium white, at the end, after several attempts, we realized that we can actually exploit the natural pattern of the surface, because it was a very rough surface of the paint samples. Okay, so as image acquisition, we actually use a 3-dimensional image acquisition by means of a profilometer. So basically, a profilometer enables to acquire 3-dimensional image, so the 8 profiles during the formation. And I should mention that one important part of the methodology is also the accurate measurement of the cross-sectional area that we do in the following way. So what you see here is the objective of the profilometer, and this is the sample that we put underneath the objective. You see that the sample is put on a mirror, and I will explain you why. So initially, with the objective, with the current position of the objective in focus, we take the 8 profile of the top surface of the image. So this is the profile, the 8 profile of this top surface. Next, we move downwards the objective, and we look at the reflection of the paint, and particularly at the reflection of the back surface of the paint. And we take the 8 profile of this side of the paint. So if we position them with respect to each other at the right distance, that actually relates to the change in focus of the microscope, because this change in focus is actually equal to 2 times the thickness of the frame plus the thickness of the paint. We can actually accurately evaluate the local thickness that you see here in this figure, and from the local thickness, since we can also accurately measure the width, we have a cross-sectional area. This seems a trivial step, but consider that when we prepare the samples, of course, we know theoretically what should be the thickness, because we have an applicator, but the sample shrinks. So this is actually the actual thickness that we get. And here you see that it's quite homogeneous, so it seems that nothing is happening too much. But if we project this into the future, supposing that we would like to analyze samples that are actually less controlled or extracted from real art objects, real cross-sectional, so maybe the surface is more rough, is less regular, and in this way we could accurately measure the cross-sectional area. Okay, so now just a few details on the technique that we use to correlate the images. We have already seen a presentation this morning. So digital image correlation is a full field displacement measurement technique that works in the following way. So basically, it calculates the displacement by comparing images that are taken before the formation and after the formation. So I show you an example. So suppose that we have this image. We track the position of each pixel. So this is the position of a pixel in the undeformed configuration. You see also why the patterning is important, because with this pattern, actually we can recognize the position in the images. So next, we take the image after the formation, and in this case, you see that the original pigment, the pixel has moved to a second point, and the distance between these 2 points is actually the displacement field. So by means of a conservation of grayscale principle, that means that the intensity of the pixel remains constant during the formation. Without going into details, by minimization of the residual, we can actually calculate the displacement and then the strain field. Just a detail, we use local digital image correlation. That means that we repeat this procedure not ensuring global continuity of the displacement, but just on local subsets. Okay, so let me show you now the procedure. Now we are ready to do the tensile test. What you see here is the sample that is mounted on the tensile stage. And what we do first is to cut the 2 bridges that I showed you before, and then we can start to apply the load. So for each loading step, we take an image, then we apply load, we take a second image, then we apply load. I should mention, we wait for the force to relax, and then we take another image, and so forth. And we continue up to the failure of the sample. So we have the force that is recorded during the experiments. We have the cross-sectional area that we have accurately evaluated, as I discussed before. And then we have the strain that is processed by means of digital image correlation. So we can combine everything to plot stress-strain response. As I mentioned, this is just the only result that I will show you. The benchmark sample is actually Prussian blue, but we can have as a target properties the stiffness, the strength, the strained break. So this strain is actually the average of the strain that is measured by digital image correlation. So this is actually the evolution of the strain profile during loading. And what we hope to see, which is partially evident in this, you see that there are some strain localization that are quite uniform. Strain localization means that we have strain concentration that are in the direction of loading, and we hope to see actually that there is a correlation between the microstructural feature and the strain profile. So we can actually hope to see where the microstructural origin of damage is present. Also, you see here, this is the strain in the direction of loading, but perhaps you can also have information also on the strain in the transverse direction, which is not exactly the Poisson's ratio, but it can also give information on that. So to conclude, I mentioned what we are doing. As I said, we have developed the methodology, but now we will systematically test all the samples that we prepared, so the Prussian blue and the titanium white. We will actually also try to do chemical analysis to see if there is some correlation between the chemistry and the mechanics, and this is work in collaboration with Susanne and her supervisor, Martin van Bommel. Since it's always questionable if accelerated aging is reliable or not, we will also try to compare the result with naturally aged samples of the same type. Actually, I should have mentioned that the samples that we prepared, we try to be as much as closer to the composition of the samples that were prepared from Marion Mecklenburg that were provided by Laura. So this work will be done in collaboration also with Laura and Francesca Izzo. And finally, what I find very interesting, which I think also somehow relate to a better understanding of the response of the paint, is that we are not just doing only tensile testing, but we try also to do loading and unloading, because I feel that there is still some gap in the knowledge on what is the irreversible response of the paint. So you see that here we load the sample, we load the sample up to a certain point, then we unload, then we load again, then we unload up to failure. So what we want to see is actually whether you see that despite here we do not go to zero, this is just a preliminary analysis, there is the appearance of some irreversible deformation, which also is something that opens to new question. Is this a really reversible deformation, or is this a deformation that will be recovered? So is actually a viscous deformation, a viscoelastic deformation? So there are several things that we can actually assess and we can learn from these tests. So thank you so much, and apologies for the first part. I could not make this work. I hope that was not too messy. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for a question or two, I think. Yeah, down here. You can use this one.
Thank you. Thank you, Emanuele. It's always fascinating to see what you're working with. The tensile testing, I would love it to be if you could actually test samples from paintings in old paintings. So is there a way of sort of laser cutting or something that can help us make good samples for that?
Yeah, so I looked a bit in the literature and I thought we could use focus ion beam milling. It's not so sure that it will work because it's also something that should be done in vacuum, so it could maybe damage the paint. I mean, I'm talking not for this one. This one we are manually cutting with blades. But I've seen that other people have used this for polymers, so there is the hope that we can also adopt this for preparing paint samples. But I also think that one of the most critical aspects of the methodology is not to develop the tensile stage, but to prepare samples of a proper size, or also when you extract the paint samples from an original artwork to make sure that you can actually test it. So,
exactly, yeah. That's exciting.
Is there one up there somewhere? I can't tell who has the mic. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Emanuela. I have a question about the application of the speckle pattern. What kind of material you apply? And since you are interested between the chemical and the mechanical interaction on the material, are you sure that there is no chemical effect of this pattern on your material, on the mechanical response?
So I did not hear super well, but I think you asked me about the interaction with the chemistry, if I'm sure that there is no interaction with the chemistry in the experiments, right?
About the speckle pattern. What kind of material you apply to get your...
So I have to. So the titanium white samples. One of the reasons why we chose it is because it's a pigment that is non-reactive, so it actually eliminates all these additional features. If we would test lead white, then of course that can also create metal soaps, ion migration, and so then it would be much more complex.
Thank you.
Without a microphone, the question was, what materials do you use to apply your speckle pattern?
How do you apply the speckle pattern? Yeah. The speckle pattern for the DIC? What do you use to apply that with?
So we use an airbrush. Maybe I can show you in the... it's too long way. So we use a solution of ethanol with polystyrene particles, and we spray it with an airbrush at a certain distance. I don't know if it's visible in this. So we put the sample at a certain... No, sorry. It's here. So we put the sample at a certain distance, and then this is an airbrush from which we spray the solution onto the sample.
It's a solution of what? What's in the solution?
It's ethanol with polystyrene particles that are about 1 micrometer size.
Thank you. Emanuela, I've got a question which may sound like criticism, but it's not. It's actually a question. So when we are looking at the metal soaps with our nano-indentation, and Jonah showed this poster, so we believe that we've got some means to measure actually mechanical properties, which I think would be fantastic to see how it may work together with your model. But interesting thing which we observed was that this crystalline part of the metal soap is embedded into the amorphous part, and I wonder if this is something typical or not. Is it happening? Like because does it matter for your model at all?
I saw that yesterday in Jonah's presentation. He mentioned that there was this. From what I know, that talking with these people like you, Nerman, Spitidema, that have worked a lot on metal soaps. Maybe rather than being enclosed, you have always somehow certain zones that are more crystalline and other that are still in a more amorphous state. But I could not really generalize I really don't know. So.
I've got on. Oh yes, because you know, I like in my simple mind of the physicist, it is like this amorphous part is like transforming into crystalline. So I would expect those two phases, be present together. But okay, I don't know what kind of effect, if any, it can have for your model. Oh, sorry. So I'm just saying that in my mind, like physicist, it's like this transformation is from the amorphous phase to crystalline. So those two phases need to be present somehow together for growing of this part. So I would wonder, but of course I don't know what kind of effect it may have for your simulation. Maybe not, but.
We do also have a zone which we call transition zone, which is very thin because we consider this to be the reaction zone, in which we have the two existing phases at the same time. So once it crystallizes, we assume that the reaction is irreversible. But in this reaction zone, in which we have both phases at the same time, we do have amorphous metal soap and crystalline metal soap at the same time. So this is also consistent with what Joanna mentioned yesterday. I just don't know. I thought you asked me about cross-sectional observation of these, and on that I cannot really reply. I don't know.
Okay, there are more questions, which is good, but given the time, I think we'll move up that direction and have discussion up there. So thank you very much once again.
Thanks.
Yeah.